Hey guys.
So same all my classes are in the same two classrooms. E201 and the last 2 semesters I had all were full concentrate technically. I don't think I had a semester where I didn't have a class in E201. Like in the past like couple of years. Since junior, senior? Yeah. Like I think the first class I had in there was thermal. And ever since thermal, like I just had a class when I'm using these buildings for. Because that's these. Isn't the third floor like EE? Yeah, I think so. And then the fourth floor, I don't even know. So maybe calculation of the class in the second floor. Oh, it was on the cross streams on those small classes. I took that and it's leave that. So just unbelievable. Same. I think everyone did. Way that a civil department teaches dynamics. I guess it's like a continuation of statics. Is the civil paper? Assuming. Oh yeah, it's in the civil. Yeah, yeah. Oh, biology lesson.
Yep. All biology. Something different.
Saying much about it.
We will after today.
It's probably a couple just on like the biology, right? A couple lectures.
This will be the only one that's pure biology. Everything else will be kind of incorporated more with like fluid mechanics and stuff like that. So
I had a question, like just out of curiosity, when like examining like blood flow through like veins and stuff like that, is it like pretty complicated just because of how irregular like the pumping of like the heart is? Because it's not really like a steady flow, it's more of like a flow stop, flow stop.
that's part of it. So it is a pulsatile flow. It does follow a pattern though, because you know as when the heart beats, it does something like that.
Supposed to be like a regular.
Exactly. It depends where you are too. So I mean, the closer you are to the heart, the more pulsatile it is. But actually, as you get further away from the heart, it actually kind of evens out to like a steady flow. It's really interesting because your blood vessels are flexible. They're not rigid. But that also makes it complicated because you have to account for the moving walls in addition for the fluid going through. Yeah.
Some volume changes.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming it kind of has something to do with like average BPM of like
Part of it, yeah. That has something to do with it too. Yeah.
That blood's the non-Newtonian fluid.
Yep.
So I'm sure that complicates things too.
It does. Yeah. Nice.
Mineral subsets.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically like 10 weeks of the class is like, you know, you have pulsatile flow, you have a non-rigid tube, and you have blood that's non-Newtonian. So how does that all affect? That's what we're going to spend a lot of this class talking about. But the funny thing is when we do simulations, we kind of just assume it's all rigid, steady. I mean, we can do pulsatile. We try to simplify it.
Is it like kind of like the vessels are so small that it's kind of like negligible?
Yeah. Some vessels are so small that it
like kind of like capillary.
Exactly. Yeah. We're going through all of that. Not today, but throughout the semester.
Was there any news about like the opening seats?
Not yet. Well, I mean, so I brought it up, but then you know a lot of people move around during the first week, and so they said we're not gonna make any changes until next week.
And by next week we should have like the
yeah.
Well, we're still talking about digging up their chest. They're asking me today how fast. Set it off. I know that. They had a working out. That's a training out. Yeah, it's remote. Yeah, it's not there. I thought it was fun. On your teacher one, I think. I just like right here. I'm not gonna. Yeah, that's. I just had to. It's on the back of my head. I think it was zero. Yes. I can't share the one that says the one. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. I'm not. Really awful. You might not have a chance. Didn't you guys ever do another online? Yeah, that's like. It's the. They also have your presence. Classic. But they're really going to be for this. What did I message?
All right, it's 4 o'clock. Let's go and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good, good. All right, so today we have our probably I think our only pure biology lecture today. And so we'll be learning about just the cardiovascular system in general. It's mostly going to be a lot of vocabulary, and so you'll be learning a lot of terms today. Just so that as we bring up these concepts, we bring up these terms in the following weeks, you'll kind of recognize them and kind of know what they are. Okay. So I told someone before the class, this is probably our only pure biology lecture. Everything else in the class it'll have aspects of biology to it, but will be incorporated with like fluid mechanics, computations, other engineering stuff. But there's at least a baseline of biological knowledge in terms that you need to have, just so that we can kind of get started on some of the other topics. And so today is kind of just a crash course in biology stuff. So one announcement. So I know there's still all of you on the wait list. So I think we're gonna wait until next week before we make any changes to the roster, to the number of seats in the class, and that's mostly just because people kind of move around naturally. So we will I'll probably have an answer for you sometime next week about that. Okay. All right. So I think that's it for my announcements. Are there any questions I can answer before we get started for today? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. And so today, like I mentioned, is basically just a biology lecture. And so we'll be talking about the cardiovascular system in general. So we'll be talking about its various components, the names of a lot of the bigger vessels, a lot of the names of the parts of the heart, as well as its functions and what the cardiovascular system does. And so it is going to go pretty fast. I do have it in PowerPoint format so that I can have some nice graphics to it. And so I will say that I'm going to throw a lot of terms at you guys today, a lot of terms that are very different. You'll see that biology people are very different than engineering people in terms of how they name stuff. So don't feel pressured to have to memorize absolutely everything from today. As we go through the class and as we kind of reintroduce some of these topics, I'll kind of remind you what they are, later on as well. But I think it helps to kind of get a lot of it done out of the way first, so that at least when these things come up later on in the class, you'll have something that you can refer to. So I definitely recommend downloading these slides, keeping them on hand, so that when certain terms or certain biological ideas come up later on, you'll have these slides to kind of reference to. Okay, so let's start with just the cardiovascular system overall. So this is our system of interest. So we're going to be working with the system, learning about the system all throughout the class. So there's a lot of systems within the human body, a lot that goes on within, and we're focusing just on one system. Okay. So the cardiovascular system, what that refers to is basically anything that involves blood inside your body. So your heart, which is the main pumping mechanism for pumping the blood, the vessels which carry the blood to all the different parts of the body, and the blood itself, which is the fluid that is inside your heart and your vessels, right? And like I mentioned on Tuesday, the primary role for the cardiovascular system is to be a transportation system. So whenever your body needs to move oxygen, needs to move nutrients, carbon dioxide, enzymes, hormones, heat, all of that travels through the cardiovascular system. So it really is kind of like the freeways or the infrastructure of the human body. And like we mentioned on Tuesday, that among all your body systems are important to maintain. The cardiovascular system is no exception. And so regular diet, a good diet, regular exercise, this is very important to keep your cardiovascular system healthy, and ensuring your cardiovascular system stays healthy throughout your life is very important if you want to live a long, fulfilling life. And there's a lot of blood vessels in your body. So like I mentioned last time, if you connected all of them end to end, you would have about 60,000 miles or 100,000 kilometers. And so imagine all that is kind of bundled up inside your body, which is kind of amazing to think about. Okay, so let's go into a bit more detail about the functions of the cardiovascular system. So the roles that it plays, right? So there's four main functions. And so the first and probably most important one is the transport of molecules or transport of nutrients in the body, right? And so the way your body is designed is that, each system or each part of your body is not able to get everything that it needs to survive within its own neighborhood, right? For example, all of your muscles and all of your organs need oxygen in order to operate. But let's say that, your arm muscle, right? Your arm muscle has no way of obtaining oxygen from the air around it. So the only way that your arm muscle can obtain oxygen is if you intake the oxygen through your mouth, through your nose, it goes to your lungs absorb the oxygen, and then the cardiovascular system then takes that oxygen from your lungs to your muscles or wherever it needs it. Okay. So this is really essential because a lot of your body parts are really kind of specialized in what they do. And they rely on kind of working together with the other, body parts or other organs inside your body to perform its function. And the cardiovascular system is the primary way in which, the different organs and different parts of your body can really work together and give each other everything that they need. Okay. So oxygen transport, that's probably the first thing that people talk about when you talk about, blood. On the flip side, after your body takes in oxygen, it does, the cells do its thing. It produces carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is not particularly useful for your body. And so your blood is also responsible for taking carbon dioxide from your body back to the lungs. And so you can breathe out that carbon dioxide. Okay. And of course, everything else that needs to be transported, vitamins and nutrients that come from your gastrointestinal system, from the food that you eat, that moves from there to the different parts of your body via the bloodstream. Hormones that your body produces gets to where it needs to be through the cardiovascular system. Same thing with enzymes and just whatever else your system, your body produces. Okay. All right, number two, defense and healing. And so your immune system is housed within your cardiovascular system. In fact, most of the main players in your immune system, like your white blood cells, your T cells, things like that, all of those exist within the bloodstream, right? And so whenever you get an infection, whenever you get an illness, your immune system kicks in. And then again, it rides along the cardiovascular system to get to where it needs to be, to fight off the bacteria or viruses or whatever it needs to do. Okay. Same thing for any kind of physical wound that your body experiences as well. So let's say that you scrape your knee. Usually, what happens is that your knee starts to bleed, and what happens there is that your blood also contains a lot of these molecules called platelets, and those platelets help in healing that wound and making sure you're okay afterwards. And again, the platelets are housed within your cardiovascular system. Number three, thermoregulation. So blood, because it's the only kind of really moving fluid throughout your whole body, it actually acts as a very effective heat exchanger. So if you've taken heat transfer 407, or if you're in it right now, you've probably learned a lot about heat exchangers and how they're very efficient in terms of cooling and heating certain devices. Well, your bloodstream is your kind of very natural kind of heat exchanger. And so when your body needs to lose heat, it heats, your internal organs heat up the blood then travels close to the skin where it can kind of let off the heat, right? And the opposite is true as well. So when your body needs to warm up, your blood kind of goes close to the skin, and any kind of external heat that you apply wearing a jacket or wearing a blanket or staying indoors with the heater on, right? Your bloodstream is how, the heat can get from the outside to other parts of your body. So being the only kind of flowing fluid in your body kind of helps with this. And number 4, there's this kind of a miscellaneous role. It's also very important, but there's a lot of things that kind of come into this category here. So a lot of the organs in your body kind of really also rely on having a very delicate balance of moisture and water and of other kind of fluids in your body. So your cardiovascular system kind of helps keep all those fluids kind of in balance. And if there's an excess or if there's a deficit, your cardiovascular system can help with those as well. So there's a lot that kind of falls under this umbrella, but we won't be talking about too much in this class. So I put it number 4. Okay, so those are the 4 main functions of the cardiovascular system. So some 1 and 2 I'd say very biological, 3 is very physical, very engineering like, and 4 is back to biology. Any questions on this so far? Okay, so let's talk about the components of the cardiovascular system. And so these are just kind of the broad components in general. A lot of the blood vessels inside your body have actually specific names, and your heart actually has specific names for all different components. We'll talk about that in a bit, but I think it's kind of useful first to talk about the very broad components and what they're called and what their roles are. Okay. So there's 5 main components. So blood, probably the most important one, that is the circulating fluid. And so that is the kind of the way that your body transports stuff. That's the thing that flows inside your heart and your blood vessels. Next, we have the heart. So the heart is kind of it's the main pumping mechanism, right? And so in order, whenever you have an internal flowing fluid, right? So anytime you have moving fluid that's internal, you need some kind of pump to drive the flow. And the heart is that pump, right? And so what your heart does is that your heart's very muscular. So it's a muscle that can produce kind of contractions, and those contractions produce the kinetic energy that's needed to drive the blood throughout the body, right? So your heart is very, very important. The only muscle in your body that never takes a break, because if it takes a break, then lots of bad things will happen. Okay, so now let's talk about the vessels themselves. And so the vessels can be broken down into 3 different categories. So we have arteries, and we have veins, and we have capillaries. Okay. So the arteries are called, what I like to think about them as the distribution system. So it carries blood away from the heart, and it takes it to the places where it needs to go. Okay. There's a misconception out there that says arteries contain oxygenated blood. Which is it's true, I think, for maybe about 90% of your cardiovascular system, but it's not true everywhere. So we'll talk about that in a bit. And so the better way to think about your arteries is that they take blood away from your heart. Your blood supplies the kinetic energy, and it travels through the arteries to get to the places where it needs to go. Okay, so your arteries are very much the distribution system of your cardiovascular system. 4 are the capillaries. So the capillaries are the exchange system. And so at the end of the arteries, let's say you get to your organs, you get to your muscles, you have all these kind of tiny little capillaries. And so this image right here is actually very zoomed in. And each of these individual channels that you can see here, so something like this, right? Each of those little fibers in that web is actually a channel for the blood to go through. And so each of those are so tiny that oftentimes you can only fit 1 blood cell through that channel at any given time. Okay. But the capillaries serve a very important role because, like we mentioned, because your cardiovascular system is carrying all this oxygen and all these nutrients, your organs and your muscles need a way to extract that oxygen from the and nutrients from the blood. And so it does so in the capillaries. And so physically what happens is that you have, these capillaries are so small and it's only small enough just for one blood cell to squeeze through. And as that blood vessel is squeezing through, it's making contact with the vessel walls and it's pulling out, all the oxygen and nutrients from there before it moves on to the other side. Okay. So the capillaries serve a very, very important role. In fact, we'll be talking about a lot of cardiovascular diseases, namely like high blood pressure. High blood pressure is usually some kind of issue with the capillaries most of the time. Okay. All right. And so the last part are the veins. And so the veins are the collection system. And so once the blood passes through the capillaries and they do their exchange, they do everything they need to do, the blood needs to return to the heart so it can be, redistributed to other parts of the body. So the veins are that system where it collects the blood and brings it back to the heart. Okay. Again, there's the misconception that veins carry deoxygenated blood or blood that doesn't have any oxygen, which is true a lot of the time, but there are certain parts of the body where that's not true. So, I want you to think about the veins as the collection system or the system that brings it back to the heart. Okay. All right, so these are the five main parts of the cardiovascular system. The main ones, I want you to think about are the arteries and the veins, because that's where we're going to be able to do most of our analysis. Okay, and so the arteries and veins make up the blood vessels, and so these are all the tubing that you see in the body. Okay, technically speaking, the capillaries are also tubes, but they're often so small that it's very difficult for us to model it and simulate and do calculations there. So there are calculations you can do with the capillaries, but they're less fluid mechanics and more kind of empirical relationships. And so the ones that we'll be focusing on mostly in this class are the arteries and the veins, and mostly the arteries. So that's kind of what you see the most, and physically they're kind of the more interesting than the veins too. Okay. We'll be talking about the heart a little bit, but this class mostly focuses on the fluid mechanics of the arteries. Okay. All right. Any questions on this so far? Okay, so let's see how all of these are organized. So this is a figure here. So I appreciate this figure because it looks like it was done in Microsoft PowerPoint with just these boxes. And so, but there's a lot going on here, but I want to kind of highlight different portions and relate it to kind of where we were on the previous slide. Okay. So let's start by highlighting kind of the major parts here. So in the middle right here, this big red box. This is your heart. And so your heart is comprised of these 4 chambers right here. And they're responsible for pumping blood through your body. Okay. In particular, I want to focus on this loop right here. So if you follow these arrows and you kind of use this as kind of the starting point here, right? So blood exits the heart, it goes through your arterial system, okay? Then it goes through the capillaries and then comes back through the veins right here, okay? So that right there is the main loop that blood goes through in your body, right? So we call this side the systemic circulation, okay? The lungs have their own circulation that we'll talk about in a second, but for the most part, for all of your muscles and all the organs in your body, it kind of follows this path where the blood leaves the heart, it goes through the arteries, it passes through the capillaries, gets collected by the veins, that comes back through the heart, okay? So that's the systemic circulation. That's what we mostly have in blue right there, okay? Whereas the lungs have their own circulation where, it's similar. And so it leaves the heart, goes through the pulmonary arteries, passes through the lungs itself, and comes back through the veins, okay? So you have kind of 2 loops here that are going on. So you have one loop that goes through the rest of your body and one loop that goes through your lungs, and where kind of all that gets exchanged is through the heart right here. Okay. All right, so here are the arteries. The arteries here are all on the right side, and the veins here are on the left, right? And so if we kind of draw out the loops from before, you can see here that once the blood leaves the heart, the first thing it passes through are the arteries, right? Remember, the arteries are the distribution systems. The arteries take the blood from the heart and takes it to where it needs to go, right? So on the bottom there, we're going in a clockwise direction, and in the top, we're going in the counterclockwise direction, okay? And so remember I mentioned that, you know, for the most part, arteries contain oxygenated blood, except in the lungs, okay? And so if we look at the oxygenation of the blood, you know, it looks something like this. So for your systemic circulation to the rest of your body, you know, your arteries there have all the oxygen because they just came back from the lungs. But if you look at the pulmonary circulation, if you look at the blood that goes to the lungs, right? If the blood has to go to the lungs, that means it doesn't have any oxygen, right? And so your pulmonary arteries do not have oxygen, right? That's why they're highlighted in blue. Okay. Then once they pass through the lungs, you know, once they pass through the lungs, then they do get oxygen, and then they come back this way here. Okay. And so overall, we kind of have like a figure 8, you know, pattern here. So the exact pattern kind of goes like that in that kind of loop. Right? So yeah, so there's a lot going on in these figures, but you know, that's kind of the entire cardiovascular system in a nutshell. So you start with the heart pumps blood to the arteries, it gets passes through the capillaries, comes back through the veins, okay, and then it goes to the lungs and kind of goes through that same process, right? Okay. Any questions on this diagram right here? This is a very simplified diagram, but it's I think it's useful just for kind of highlighting stuff. But you know, for the most part, you know, when people think of blood flow, they think of this bottom loop right here. So the pulmonary circulation is comparatively a lot smaller, but it's useful to kind of look at it from. Okay. All right, so let's get to the heart. And so this is where the vocabulary kind of steps it up a notch because the heart has a lot of parts to it, and it's and there's a lot to name here, right? Okay, so this right here is a diagram of the heart itself, right? It doesn't look like a heart, so you know, and a heart by meaning, you know, this thing right here, right? I have no idea how that came to be the symbol for the heart when a human heart is absolutely nothing like that at all. But I guess here we are, right? So the heart is broken up into lots of different components. And so, you know, we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about what each of those components. Okay. Okay. So the first thing I want to mention are the ventricles. So the ventricles are, the ventricles are these two chambers right here. So we have the left ventricle and the right ventricle. Okay. If you're wondering why the left ventricle is on the right and the right ventricle is on the left, that's because it's left and right relative to your own person. So it's like you're looking at the person, you know, from the front. And so, you know, to us, this left ventricle is on the right, but to the person that owns this heart, whichever cartoon they're a part of, you know, their left ventricle was on the left. So that's why it's like that. Okay, so the ventricles are the main pumping chambers of the heart, and so they are the most muscular. And so, you know, when your heart beats, that's basically your ventricles are contracting. And so the way your heart pumps blood is that blood first fills this left ventricle, and then the muscles around the ventricles will contract, right? So these two walls will basically come in, right? And then as they come in, that pushes blood out of the ventricles through the arteries, okay? All right. So there's two of them. And so remember, like I showed you on the previous side, there are two main circulations in the body. There's the systemic circulation, which goes to, you know, I call it the rest of your body, which are all your organs and your muscles. And then there is the pulmonary circulation, which goes to your lungs, okay? So your left ventricle, this one right here, your left ventricle is responsible for pumping blood through the systemic circulation, okay? And because, you know, the rest of your body is a lot bigger than just your lungs, generally speaking, your left ventricle is a lot more muscular. And so what you'll see is that this wall right here, okay, we call this the left ventricular wall. It's a lot thicker because your left ventricle has to be a lot stronger to pump blood through basically your entire body, with the exception of your lungs, okay? Whereas your right ventricle pumps blood to your lungs, right? So you can see here, if you follow this arrow right here, it goes into this little purple vessel, and this purple vessel you can see are the pulmonary arteries, right? And so since there's not as much vasculature, your lungs are kind of a much smaller organ than the rest of your body combined, the right ventricle doesn't have to be as strong. And so what you'll see from medical images is that your right ventricle is less muscular. So this kind of wall right here, there's still some decent muscle to it, but when you compare it to the left ventricle, it's a lot smaller. Mostly just because it doesn't have to work nearly as hard as the left ventricle. Okay. But both are very important. So the ventricles are probably the most important part of your heart, because they're the ones that's doing the pumping. Okay. Okay, so right next to the ventricles, we have the atrium. So we have the left atrium and the right atrium. Okay. And so the left atrium is right here, and the right atrium is right here. Okay. And so your atria, they're a little bit muscular themselves, and so they, sometimes you'll see in the literature where the atria are just passive chambers. They're not completely passive. They do have a little bit of muscle to them. Okay, but it's not nearly as much. So the main role of the atria is mostly to collect the blood. Okay, so when blood returns to your heart through the veins, either through the pulmonary veins or through the atria. Okay, they come through they come to the atrium. Okay, and so when blood returns from the rest of your body, it comes to the right atrium. So you have two main veins that do that. So we have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Okay. And they come into the right atrium. Okay. The blood collects there. And then at a certain point, your blood empties out from the atrium to the ventricles. Okay. Then once the ventricles are full, this valve shuts off, and then the ventricles can kind of push it out. Right? So the atrium serve a very important role, because you can almost think of them as kind of like the waiting room of your heart. Right? Because when blood returns to your heart, the blood has very little energy. Sometimes they don't have any oxygen, or depending on which side of the heart that you're in, and so it needs to travel to somewhere else, right? But your ventricle is only so big, so in order to kind of gate it and to make sure that the ventricles can pump properly, the atrium kind of acts as kind of like a storage chamber, like a waiting room, right? So after the ventricles pump, then when they relax, then blood comes in from the atria into the ventricles, okay? And so it's kind of like a two-stage process. So when blood returns to the heart, it gets stored in the atrium temporarily. Then once the ventricles are ready, the blood travels from the atrium to the ventricles. And then from the ventricles pump, and then it expels blood through the arteries, okay? All right. So the atrium, they're just collecting chambers. So they receive the blood and then they pass it to the ventricles when the ventricles are ready. Okay. And again, you have left and right atrium that are connected to the left and right ventricles. Okay. And so this view right here that you're seeing is typically what's called the four-chamber view. So you can see all four main chambers of the heart: the left atrium, the right atrium, the left ventricle, the right. Okay. All right, so part number 3, also a vitally important part of your heart are the valves. Okay, so you can see here that there are 4 main valves in the heart. So they're kind of indicated by these kind of saber-tooth looking things right here. They don't actually look like saber tooths, but when you draw a 2D picture, it's kind of hard to draw them. So the valves, they act just like your understanding of valves in reality. So they basically make sure that blood can only flow in one direction. Okay. And so, they basically make sure that blood, doesn't backflow through the heart. That would cause a lot of issues. But most importantly, it makes sure that you don't have any mixing of blood. Okay. So the valves serve a very, very important role, because when your ventricle contracts, right, because your heart is very much a physical pump that generates its power through squeezing, right? When your ventricles squeeze, you want to make sure that the blood only travels in one direction, right? So you only want to make sure that it travels out the way it's supposed to go out. If you have blood that travels back into the atrium, right, that would be really bad, because then your heart would have to work much harder than it needs to, because the blood is kind of leaking through your heart. Okay. So the valves serve a very important role, and if you have kind of faulty valves in your heart, that's usually a very serious issue that you need to get taken care of. So that's something that we'll talk about a little bit today, but kind of more throughout the class as well. Okay. All right, so those are the three main parts of the heart. So we have ventricles, two atria. Atria are the collecting chambers, and the valves, which make sure that everything is going in the right direction. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the heart cycle, right? And so, like I mentioned, your heart pumps, right? And so the way your heart pumps is that it squeezes, right? But if you've ever squeezed or anything really, right? You squeeze like a water bottle. I don't know why that's the thing that I thought of, right? You squeeze it and then water comes out of it, right? But if you want to squeeze it again, you can't just keep squeezing it. You have to let it kind of open up and relax first, right? So your heart is the same way, and so your heart can't continuously contract, otherwise it wouldn't be able to perform its function. And so there are various cycles to the heart, to the heart pumping, where it pumps, but after it pumps, it needs to relax in order to make sure that it does everything that it needs to do. Okay, and so we call this entire process the heart cycle, right? And so it refers to all the actions that the heart undergoes when it's pumping. Okay, so there's two main terms, more vocabulary. I know this might be the 17th and 18th terms that we've gone over today, but these are the terms that we medically use to refer to the phases of the heart cycle. Right? So the first term, it's called systole, and so that E is actually a long E, so you do pronounce that, right? So systole refers to when your heart chamber is when your ventricles are contracting. Okay, so when your heart is contracting, it's squeezing. We call that systole, right? Then the relaxation phase, so when the heart is kind of filling up again, when it's relaxing, we call that diastole, right? So systole and diastole. All right. And so as you can imagine, as your heart pumps, it's going to change the fluid mechanics of the blood throughout your body, right? So blood pressure is maximum during systole, right? So that makes sense. So as your heart is squeezing, it kind of causes a spike in pressure in your cardiovascular system because that's what's driving the flow, right? So your blood pressure is maximum during this period, okay? And then during diastole, when your heart is kind of relaxing and kind of filling again, that's when your blood pressure is at a minimum. Okay. And so in reality, if you were to measure the blood pressure over time, right? So this is time, this is pressure. Okay. Your blood pressure kind of follows this kind of trend right here. So the pumping of the heart actually happens very quickly. So your heart, your cardiac muscles are quite strong. So the pumping kind of happens very rapidly. So what you see is kind of a very rapid increase in pressure as the heart is pumping. Okay. So during this period right here, this is systole. Okay. So after that kind of very rapid pumping period, then it takes a while for your heart to relax. And so what you see is that you kind of have a small or slow gradual decrease in pressure. So during this entire period of relaxation, this right here is diastole. And so if you were to stick a probe inside your body and measure the blood pressure as a function of time, it would look something like this. And then, after the heart is done relaxing, after it fills up completely, then it contracts again. So this plot here kind of repeats itself. And so we go, oops. We go kind of up like this rapidly, and then slow decrease. Up rapidly, and slow decrease. Okay. If you've watched any kind of like medical TV drama, and you've seen kind of like heart monitor, they might be measuring the blood pressure. It probably looks something like this. Okay. Okay. So blood pressure, if you've ever gone to a doctor's office, that's almost something that they almost always measure, because your blood pressure is an indication of your overall cardiovascular health. Okay? But if you notice, your blood pressure is always reported as two numbers, right? And so the doctor kind of gives you one number, and then it's over another number, right? So one example would be 120/80. Right? And so the reason they give you two numbers is that the first number here This first number is your systolic blood pressure. So that's the maximum blood pressure that's inside your body throughout one heart cycle. Okay. And the second number is your diastolic blood pressure. So that's the minimum, right? And so I don't know, shouldn't have erased it. Okay, so if you draw out the pressure again, okay. So your systolic pressure is up here. Okay, so that's the first number. That's the first number that they give you when they measure your blood pressure. And your diastolic pressure is down here. Okay. Right, so they measure those two numbers because there are lots of conditions where maybe you have elevated systolic pressure, maybe you have elevated diastolic pressure or depressed diastolic pressure. The difference between systolic and diastolic pressure is something important for a lot of diseases. Maybe you have both elevated and so on and so forth. Okay, but they often report both numbers, and so if you're ever wondering, what those two numbers mean, that's essentially what they mean. Okay. I actually went to the doctor last week, and the nurse was measuring my blood pressure. And so, usually the way they measure it, they put the cuff around your hand and it inflates and you feel kind of uncomfortable a little bit, and then it deflates, right? So they measured my blood pressure and then like, ooh, that's kind of high. Let's measure it again. And so they measured it and they're like, oh, that's much better. You're much healthier. I'm like, really? You measure it twice and then you wait for the one that looks good. That's the one you put into my file. So like if I'm in danger, like you should tell me. Like don't keep measuring until I look fine.
Take the average.
Maybe they took the average. They should have done it 3 times then. She only did it twice. She only did it twice and she took the second one. Anyway, so I hope I'm okay. I feel okay, but I guess we'll see in 20 years, I guess. All right. And in case you were wondering, what units these are in, because they don't tell you the units, they just tell you the numbers, right? The units for blood pressure is actually very interesting. So it's called mmHg. And what that stands for is millimeters of mercury. So this part's trivia, so it's not all that important for this class. But before we've developed all this really nice technology, the arm cuff that inflates. The way that they measured blood pressure is actually through a pitot tube. And so if you recall from fluid mechanics, the one way that you can measure blood pressure is through a tube that kind of comes in like this, right? It's a kind of a very crude drawing of one, right? And then depending on what the pressure is here, it's going to elevate a column of fluid, right? And then depending on the height of that fluid, that's going to tell you what the pressure in your blood is going to be. Okay. So back in the way old days, before technology, the fluid that they use inside this pitot tube was actually liquid mercury. And so they don't actually put liquid mercury in your blood. They connect it in a way where it doesn't infect you, hopefully. But the reason they use mercury was that mercury is a very, very dense fluid. And so when you're measuring the blood pressure, it doesn't cause huge spikes in the fluid column. And so this millimeters of mercury literally refers to the height change or the height change in millimeters of mercury that occurs from your blood pressure. Okay. Since then, we've come up with much better ways of measuring blood pressure. But I guess, they're kind of stuck in their ways of reporting blood pressure like that. So, it would be a lot nicer to use things like pascals or PSI or kilo PSI, but they're doctors and they're very stubborn. And so they use that convention. So if you're ever curious what the standard units for blood pressure are, that's what they are. Okay. All right. Any questions on this so far?
So did they just like cut you open and then see what the pressure is that came out of it?
No. I think what they did was they kind of drew your blood through a tube and then they ran it through an external system.
Connected to mercury.
Yeah. So don't ask me exactly how it works. I don't know, but that's how they do it. Yeah. No one died from mercury poisoning back then. I think.
Yeah, wasn't it?
Yeah. Or if they did, they just didn't, it's unreported. Okay. Okay. So I actually thought I had these slides swapped, so I don't know why I had this one in the middle, but let's talk about the valves again. So we're back to the heart. So like I mentioned that there are four main valves inside your heart, right? And they each have a name, and the names are very hard to remember. So but the valves are very important parts of your heart, so it's good to go over them. Okay, so if you can see from this image here, basically everywhere that you see a valve, right? The valve is always at the outlet of a chamber, right? And so if you look at the left atrium here, right? So the left atrium, the blood flows this way, right? And so at the outlet of that chamber, we have a valve here. Same thing for the ventricle. So as the blood, goes through the ventricle, it exits out this way, right? So you basically just follow the arrows. And then whenever there is an exit from a valve, from a chamber, you have a valve right there, okay? So remember, each of these valves, their main purpose is to make sure that blood doesn't backflow. The blood only goes in a single direction, okay? So each of these valves here have a different name. So there's the tricuspid valve. So the tricuspid valve exists between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So that's this valve right here, okay? So it gets its name because the tricuspid valve has kind of three leaflets. So it looks like three, leaves that kind of all converge into one spot, right? It's kind of unique in that sense, right? Next, we have the pulmonary valve. So the pulmonary valve exists at the exit of the right ventricle. So that's this one here, okay? So that prevents backflow. So once the blood leaves the heart and goes to your lungs, the pulmonary valve makes sure that the blood doesn't come back through the heart, okay? Next, we have the mitral valve. So the mitral valve is this one right here in between the left atrium and the left ventricle, right? And so same thing, it makes sure the mitral valve has a very important role because, when the left ventricle pumps, the left ventricle is very powerful because it has to pump blood through the rest of your body. And so the mitral valve is kind of the strongest valve in your body to make sure that, the blood only goes out the arteries and doesn't come back through the atrium. And then there's the aortic valve, which is the valve that comes right here. Okay, so all of these valves kind of hold a very important purpose. Okay? Next, we have the names of the major vessels around the heart as well. Okay, so we've already talked about the pulmonaries, and so we have the pulmonary artery. Okay, so that takes blood away from the heart to the lungs, and the pulmonary vein. Okay, so the pulmonary vein returns blood from the lungs to the heart. Okay. So whenever you see the word pulmonary involves the lungs themselves. Okay? Next, we have the vena cava. So remember, we have two vena cava. We have the superior vena cava. That's the one that comes from the top. That returns blood from your arms, your shoulders, your head, your brain. Okay. And then we have the inferior vena cava. And so that returns the blood from your lower body. So your torso, your legs, your feet, things like that. Okay. And so the vena cava empty out into the right atrium. And then we have the aorta. And so the aorta is a blood vessel we'll be talking about a lot in this class. So the aorta is the biggest artery inside your body. So when the blood first leaves your heart, it exits into the aorta, and then your aorta basically distributes that blood through the rest of your body. Okay. Yeah.
When it comes to like valves, are there like certain losses that are like, I guess like associated with those valves, kind of like in fluid mechanics when you learn about like the K losses of like through a bend?
Oh yeah. There's definitely those losses, and so generally the healthier you are, your valves are very flexible, and so when they open up, they open up completely, and then the losses are minimized. There's still losses because you have fluid that's kind of coming through a specific orifice, and it's kind of colliding with the leaflets a little bit. But generally, if you're pretty healthy and your valves are flexible, the losses are minimal. But then as you get older or as you kind of get more unhealthy, what happens that your valves kind of get more stiff. And so they don't open up as much as they used to. And so if they don't open up nearly as much, then the blood kind of gets caught on that. Your losses get higher. So that's kind of what leads to like higher blood pressure and other things as well. So yeah, those losses are very, very important.
Are there like actual numbers like connected to those losses, or are they just kind of like oh, like the older you get, like the more losses they are kind of?
Oh yeah, there's definitely numbers to it. But I think the primary way that they measure it is they measure the pressure drop through the valve. And so when the valve is completely open, they measure the pressure drop as you go from one chamber to the next. So ideally, that pressure drop should be minimized. Otherwise, there'd be higher losses. But if you see a very large pressure drop, then that's usually what doctors indicate that this person needs a replacement valve. And yeah.
So for like, would high pressure be related to valves and low pressure be, like low blood pressure be like more of a ventricular problem? Like a pump
So
problem?
usually when your blood pressure is too low, that's usually not too big a concern unless it's dangerously low. If your blood pressure is dangerously low, that means your heart is probably failing. So, but high blood pressure, high blood pressure could be caused by a lot of things. The valves are one particular cause. But actually for most people, it's actually in their capillaries. So once your capillaries start to kind of die off or get stiff, that's what causes high blood pressure for a lot of people. Any other questions on this slide? Okay. So I should have just gone to the next page. So this kind of shows the valves. And so for a healthy valve, when it opens up, you kind of get this really nice opening right here. And when it closes completely. So actually, the closing part is actually the part that's most important because you want to make sure that there's kind of nothing leaking through the valves. But as your valves kind of get diseased, visually it actually kind of looks like this. It kind of looks like gunk kind of builds up on your valves themselves. And they kind of get calcified, they get stiff. And so they can't open all the way and they can't close all the way. And so, these kind of lead to issues for people. So healthy valves are really important. And I include this slide here because a lot of you probably have heard of there's a biomedical company in Irvine called Edwards Life Science. And this is kind of what the Irvine location specifically, this is kind of what they specialize in, is in valves. And so I know a few previous senior design projects have worked on things for valves for Edwards Life Science. So yeah. Okay. So that's everything with the heart. So let's talk about the blood vessels themselves, right? So your blood vessels, remember, these are kind of the main tubing that's inside your body. Okay. But what's unique about the blood vessels relative to kind of like a pipe that you might see in a typical plumbing system is that your blood vessels are flexible. So they can kind of move, they can expand, they can contract, right? That's very useful because, generally speaking, you need to move your body around, right? And so in order to move from point A to point B, and if your blood vessels were completely rigid, you literally wouldn't be able to move your body at all. So their flexibility is a very important aspect of the of how humans work. But it also makes them very difficult to analyze. As we'll see throughout the class. But so what I'm showing you here is kind of a cross section of the vessel wall. And so your blood vessel, right? Inside here goes the blood, but the wall itself has a little bit of thickness. And so what we're examining is actually the blood vessel wall right here. So there are several different layers to the blood vessel wall. And so the outermost layer, so this is the layer that kind of interfaces with kind of the muscles and things like that. This is called the adventitia. And so the adventitia is primarily made of a material called collagen. You probably heard of collagen through maybe like a Neutrogena commercial on TV or something like that. But collagen is a very important material in your body. It's used in your skin. That's why a lot of kind of skincare products use it. But it's used a lot inside your internal organs as well. And so collagen is a kind of helps keep your body parts elastic. Okay. The next section here is the thickest section. We call that the media. Okay. This layer here contains some smooth muscle, and so your blood vessel actually have the ability to kind of actively control its shape to a degree, and that's because of the smooth muscle inside the media. Okay. And this section also includes collagen and a little bit of elastin as well, right? Trying to help keep it as flexible as possible. And then the innermost layer is called the intima. Okay? So the intima is the innermost layer. So the blood actually goes inside here. And so the intima is the only layer of your blood vessel that actually touches the blood. Okay. And then on the intima is actually a single layer of cells, right? So there are tiny cells that kind of line the intima right here. These cells play a very important role because they're interfacing directly with the blood, they're able to sense, the blood pressure, the shear stress, the velocity of the blood itself. And so, those cells actually play a very important role in kind of regulating your blood flow. So, that part is pretty important. Oops. Okay. And so, of course, one thing that's important for the blood vessels is their strength, right? Because generally speaking, you want these blood vessels not to rupture. And so the strength of the vessel wall depends on the ratio of elastin to collagen. Okay. Elastin actually helps keep it flexible, while the collagen gives the strength. Collagen is also quite flexible, but in this setting, it helps with the strength of the blood vessel. Okay. And like I mentioned, the overall thickness of this wall changes depending on where you are in the body, because because different parts of your body experience the blood pressure a little bit differently, and so some blood vessels need to be thicker than others. Okay? And so the thickness of your blood vessel wall adapts to how strong the blood forces are at that given time. All right, any questions on this? Okay. All right. So let's talk about the blood itself, right? So the blood, we've talked a lot about the physical structure, the solid structures inside your cardiovascular system, the heart and the blood vessels and the valves. But the one that we're actually examining in terms of from a fluid mechanics standpoint is blood. Okay. So blood, for the most part, we consider it a fluid, but technically it's not a pure fluid. A more kind of accurate definition for blood is that it's actually a suspension of particles inside of plasma. Right? And so, like I mentioned that blood contains all these blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and so you have all these little tiny particles flowing inside your blood. So all of those little particles are actually suspended in the blood medium. Okay, it's just that all those particles are so small that when you look at blood, from the naked eye, it looks like a flowing fluid because that's kind of what physically it does. Okay. All right. And so what's interesting about this is that because there are so many particles, and each of these particles are living, they can actually adapt themselves and change. The exact properties of blood is still kind of a heavy area of research, believe it or not. Even something as simple as just the viscosity and the density of blood, it's not that simple. So it's still very much being researched. Okay. And the main types of cells, there's a lot more that's in your blood, but the main ones are the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. So we'll kind of review what each of those are. Next. Okay, so let's talk about the red blood cells, or the RBCs. Okay, so the red blood cells are the most numerous, and so this kind of gives your blood the red color. Because for the most part, these make up the majority of the volume inside blood. Okay, and so the medical name for the red blood cells are erythrocytes. Okay, and they make up the majority of the blood cells. And so if you ever had blood drawn from your body, and you go through a blood test, they give you all of these stats and all of these different metrics for your blood. One of the stats that they give you is something called hematocrit. So hematocrit is a very important parameter, and that tells you the percentage by volume of red blood cells that are inside a human body. And what's interesting is that there's actually differences between genders. And so men typically have hematocrit between 41 to 52%. That's a pretty healthy number, while women typically have hematocrit between 36 and 48%. Okay. So typically, if you're in that range, you're in pretty good shape. All right, so the main role for the red blood cells is to carry oxygen, right? And so you can see here that the red blood cells, when you kind of look at it from the side, it kind of has this kind of little dimple to it, right? And the dimple is actually perfectly shaped, right? This curvature is perfect so that when oxygen comes in, right, you have an O2 molecule, it kind of sits and attaches right inside that dimple, right? So we have one on top and one on the bottom. And so, that's kind of the main purpose for the red blood cells. Okay. And if you're someone that undergoes a lot of athletic activity, where your body kind of demands a lot of oxygen, You know, these people tend to have higher hematocrit because, you know, your body just demands a lot more oxygen, okay? And so hematocrit is something dynamic that your body can actually regulate depending on your activity. So the more active you are, the higher your hematocrit is, the more red blood cells that you're going to have in your body. Okay. All right, any questions on this? Okay, next we have the white blood cells or WBCs. These are, you know, the main primarily responsible for your immune system. And so whenever you have foreign substances, bacteria, viruses inside your body, your white blood cells are the first ones on the scene. So they're going to be the ones that are attacking foreign substances. Okay. So their scientific name is leukocytes. There's very few of them. And so you know, if you think back to your biology education in high school, I think, you know, white blood cells are talked about a lot, but there's not that many of them. So, you know, typically they're about 0.7% of the blood volume, but they're big. And so they have to be big so that they can kind of absorb and fight any kind of bacteria or viruses that come inside your body. And there's various types of white blood cells that are specialized to attack different kinds of pathogens. Okay? And so not all white blood cells look the same. In fact, they, you know, here you have kind of a few examples here. So when your body gets infected, you know, and your body senses that it's being attacked by a foreign substance, foreign bacteria, your body can produce more white blood cells. Okay. And so you may have heard of the disease called leukemia. And so leukemia actually is you know, kind of an interesting phenomenon because when you have leukemia, your body actually produces an abnormally high amount of white blood cells. So much so that you have so many white blood cells and they're all kind of like aggressive. They want to attack something that it actually starts to destroy, you know, the living cells inside your body, right? So it's a very kind of devastating disease if you have it. Okay. And you know, the way white blood cells work is kind of the logic behind, you know, why vaccines work, or at least the old school vaccines. Now we have the mRNA vaccines, but you know, the old vaccines would kind of inject kind of a weak version of a virus inside you, and then it kind of stimulates the production of those specific white blood cells to fight that disease. Okay. All right, any questions on this? All right, and so the last aspect of blood that we'll go over are the platelets, right? And so the platelets are very tiny, so they're kind of way smaller than the white blood cells and the white blood cells. So they're mostly responsible for blood clotting, right? So when you cut yourself, the platelets are the ones that kind of rush to the scene. They all kind of, you know, they literally kind of like whenever you have a wound in your body, the platelets kind of clog up that wound and kind of stop it from bleeding, right? So the platelets can be very sticky. And so you can see here that once platelets become activated, they kind of grow all these little kind of like tendrils from the outside. And these tendrils are very sticky with each other. And so, you know, once a platelet is activated and it sees another platelet, it literally kind of holds hands with it right here. And it tries to kind of hold on to each other like that, right? And so once your body kind of activates these platelets, your platelets rush to the wound, they become really sticky, and eventually enough of these platelets kind of build up and it kind of closes off the wound. Okay, so that's the basics of blood clotting. Okay, but that's only when your platelets get activated. So for the most part, your platelets are unactivated, and so they kind of look like a little, kind of like a fruity pebble, floating around inside your body, right? And so when they're in fruity pebble form, you know, they just kind of go along with the flow. They're not sticky. You know, they just kind of, you know, they're just kind of passive particles. It's only when they become activated that they become sticky like that. Okay. And so when do they become activated? So platelets become activated when they detect an area that needs repair. So whenever you have kind of a wound or maybe you have some internal bleeding of some kind, right? That's when they become, you know, when that happens, your body releases a hormone or releases something that activates those platelets, and then it goes to repair that scene. Okay. And once they become activated, they become sticky, and then they can kind of activate other platelets around them and kind of stick to them. Okay. So that's kind of the basics of blood clotting, or coagulation, another name for blood clotting. So that's kind of how platelets work and how blood clotting works in kind of a healthy person. Sometimes, if a person has a cardiovascular disease, mostly if they have to have some kind of medical device like an external pump pumping their blood, the doctor may require the person to take something called a blood thinner. So a blood thinner is a chemical that goes inside your body that actually impedes this activation sequence, and so it actually basically tries to prevent the blood from clotting. So this is really important because if you have someone that's hooked up to an external blood pump, so let's say they're undergoing heart failure and their heart needs help to pump the blood. So you hook them up to like an external pump to kind of do that for them, right? Whenever your blood kind of flows through kind of an artificial surface or something that's not made by your body, it tends to kind of trigger this activation sequence. And so what used to happen a lot is that, even though doctors were able to create a pump that is able to kind of mimic the functions of a heart, a lot of those patients were dying because as the blood goes through that artificial pump, it would clot, and then it would kind of clot up the entire machine, and then blood would get stuck, and then the patient would die. Okay. Same thing if you had an artificial valve. So if one of your heart valves was faulty, and you had to replace it with an artificial valve, maybe one that's produced by Edwards Lifescience, the blood can clot around that valve because your body recognizes it as a foreign substance. And so to prevent that from happening, doctors will prescribe these blood thinners to kind of impede that progress, so your blood can kind of flow through those artificial parts, without any issue or with less issues. Okay? But having a blood thinner is actually very dangerous because then that kind of prevents your body from healing any kind of wound, right? So I used to work with a lot of cardiologists back when I was in grad school doing a lot of this research. And I worked with a lot of patients that had to take blood thinners. And the cardiologist would always kind of give a very morbid joke. So he would always tell his patients, like, all right, you're on blood thinners now, so if you go outside and you scrape your knee, you're going to bleed to death. So just kind of make sure you don't do that. So he said it kind of jokingly, but that's kind of how blood thinners are. So if you're on a blood thinner, and even if you get a paper cut, right, there's nothing really stopping the blood from clotting there. And so if you don't kind of patch it up well, you can literally kind of bleed out from a paper cut if you're on blood thinners. And so it's kind of a scary thought. Okay. Another way that platelets can be activated is through high levels of viscous shear stress. And so if you have a situation where the fluid mechanics produces a lot of stress on the platelets, this can cause them to become activated too. And so this is also dangerous because this can also cause clotting in unintentional areas, maybe around the heart or maybe in your brain or something like that. And so these are things that lead to heart attacks and strokes. All right, question. So hemophilia is due to blood flow not activating. Hemophilia can be caused by a lot of different things, but that's could be one possible cause where you just kind of bleed out and your platelets just never activate. Yeah, for the most part, the platelets actually aren't living things, and so they're very much just they kind of respond to the environment around them. And so unless you're on kind of a chemical blood thinner, it's very rare for that to happen. All right. Any other questions on platelets here? Yeah.
Well, do any of these other types of cells with platelets, do they need oxygen? Like,
No.
Only the red blood cells do anything with oxygen?
Yeah, only the red blood cells do something with oxygen. Yeah, but that's why they make up the majority of the volume.
I used to always hear that if you kind of don't move for a while, you could develop blood clots in your leg and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of wondering how platelets would activate that based on just no movement.
Yeah. So that's actually kind of a longer stage process because if you kind of stay sedentary for a long time, then what happens is that your heart feels like oh, I don't have to work so hard because this person's not really moving so much. And as your heart kind of gets weaker and weaker, then that kind of stiffens up the rest of your blood vessels. And so when you have stiffer blood vessels, then your blood vessels can't expand so much. Then as your blood kind of flows through those stiff vessels, it triggers a very high amount of shear stress. And then that shear stress triggers the platelets to clot. So it's a multi-stage process. All right. Any other questions on this? Okay. So then that begs the question, so we have all these particles in blood, right? And so does that mean blood is actually not a fluid, right? So I mentioned before that blood is not actually a true fluid. And so if you compare it to like water, even if you compare it to something like honey, right? Water and honey, those are more pure fluids in the sense that there's no particles that are being suspended. They're made up of molecules, but that's not the same as particles. Okay. And when you talk about, blood cells like this, it's hard to really grasp how many of these cells are actually inside your body. And so I found this image here that's a bit more accurate. And so, what you're seeing here is kind of a more realistic image of just how many blood cells can be, in a blood vessel at any given time, right? And so if you look at something like this looks really crowded. And so, the question is, does something like this, are there enough particles in here to actually affect the fluid's behavior? And the answer is yes. And so blood officially is classified as something called a non-Newtonian fluid. And so if you kind of remember from fluids class, maybe kind of the very beginning of fluids class, your instructor may have mentioned the concept of a Newtonian fluid. And so a Newtonian fluid, what that basically means is that the shear stress is linearly proportional to the velocity gradient, right? And so, this relationship right here is for a non-Newtonian fluid. But for a Newtonian fluid, what you have is the stress is equal to the viscosity times the velocity gradient. So du dy. I just have a 1D here, but in reality, the velocity gradient is a tensor. Okay. So that's what it's like for a Newtonian fluid. For non-Newtonian fluid like blood, this relationship is not linear. And in fact, this relationship right here is actually very difficult to obtain, because it depends on the size of the vessels. It depends on a lot of stuff. There's a whole field of study that's dedicated to finding out, what's the viscosity of blood. It sounds crazy because, viscosity is something that we don't really think about for most fluids, but for blood, it's actually a very complicated answer because it depends on a lot of different factors. And so that field of study is called rheology. So RHEAOLOGY. Yeah, very difficult. I would never be able to do rheology. So, and so because fluid blood is a non-Newtonian fluid, it's going to behave differently than water, right? And most importantly, that means that all of our equations that we've developed in fluid mechanics, equations like the Navier-Stokes equations, for example, conservation of mass, conservation of momentum, they don't strictly apply to blood because the Navier-Stokes depends on that Newtonian assumption. Okay. So this is kind of depressive or kind of demoralizing because we've as engineers we've spent a lot of time understanding fluids. I always tell people that you learn fluid mechanics in class, and then you can test it out when you cry. Going through fluid mechanics is so hard, right? You do all that hard work to learn fluid mechanics, and you go to blood, and then you see blood doesn't play by those rules, and so it makes it a little bit demoralizing. But luckily, all this non-Newtonian behavior, so all the weird stuff that blood does, you may have heard the term that blood is called a shear thinning. So kind of the more shear that you apply to the fluid, its viscosity actually goes down. But all this behavior, all the kind of weird stuff that blood does is only really applicable in the very tiniest of vessels or inside the capillaries. And the reason you have that is because that's when the particles start to become relevant, because the particles, start to become about the same size as the vessels themselves. And so as the cells kind of squeeze through the capillaries, that's what causes kind of a lot of the weird behavior. Okay. But for all of the larger vessels, basically all the vessels that you could see without a microscope, there are very, very small differences between blood and a Newtonian fluid, but they're mostly negligible. So, for all of the analysis that we're going to do in this class, where we're going to focus mostly on the bigger vessels, where the vessels are, diameters are probably on the orders of centimeters, we don't have to worry about that, and we can actually treat it as a Newtonian fluid. So we're going to use Navier-Stokes, we're going to use Bernoulli, we're going to use, conservation of mass, conservation of momentum. And so, we can do all that. And so we're actually going to start our review of fluids on Tuesday after this. Okay. So that's a relief. So, I bring this up just because, you know, it's probably the number one question that people ask. You go to a conference with fluid mechanics people and you give a presentation, and there's always that one guy that raises their hand. They're like, the blood is a non-Newtonian fluid. It's like, what are you gonna do? And it's like, no, well, you know, actually, there's a lot of data that supports that in the bigger vessels, it's a Newtonian fluid. It's okay. But there's always that one guy. You always got to answer his question. You got to be nice to him because it's probably like some 80-year-old guy who has a school named after him. So, be nice. All right. Any final questions on this? Okay, so I think that is it. Well, okay, there's a couple more. I thought that was the last slide. Okay. So I think the last thing I want to show you is is just some numbers here. And so if you're curious about the sizes of the different vessels, we have that here. So the biggest vessel in your body is the aorta. So the aorta has a diameter of about 2.2 centimeters, so 22 millimeters. A lot of the arteries, so we're going to be kind of in this range right here. Okay. We're going to be looking at vessels that are around, you know, maybe half a centimeter in diameter, half a centimeter to 1 centimeter. Okay. So pretty small. And so, you know, much smaller than probably what you're used to if you've worked with piping for plumbing or anything like that. These are very, very small vessels. But still, you know, centimeters, if you're on the order of centimeters, you can still be Newtonian. Okay. The nice thing about having small vessels like this is that our Reynolds number is actually going to be very small, because if you remember the formula for the Reynolds number for an internal flow, it's like the velocity multiplied by the diameter divided by the viscosity, right? Because our diameters here are really small, and actually our velocities are pretty small too, our Reynolds numbers are actually going to be quite small. And so small Reynolds numbers are good, because what this tells us is that our flow is going to be laminar. And laminar flow is, you know, orders of magnitude more easy to analyze than turbulent flow. And so it's one of the nice caveats of blood flow, where, you know, there's a lot of really complicated things with the pulsatility and the deformable walls and the suspension and the non-Newtonianness. But we get one saving grace from God in that, you know, we can actually analyze it from using laminar flow. So, you know, actually a lot of the knowledge that you learned in 333 or in your fluid mechanics class will be very applicable here. And it's one of the very few engineering applications where that's true, because, you know, if you do aerospace or anything like that, your flow is most certainly going to be turbulent. So we actually don't need to worry about turbulence at all for the most part. Okay. All right. I think the next slide is just pressure, but I think we've talked about pressure quite a bit, actually. Yeah, we'll save the discussion of pressure another time. But, you know, for the most part, I just wanted to focus on just the fluid mechanics. Any final questions before we wrap it up for today? All right, so that's all we got planned for today. And so on Tuesday, what we're going to do is we're going to start a review of fluid mechanics. And so we're going to spend the next maybe 3 lectures doing that. And so we'll review the Navier-Stokes equations. We'll review kind of core concepts like the Reynolds number, Bernoulli equation, all that good stuff. And then we'll kind of segue that into more kind of cardiovascular stuff. Okay. So thank you guys for coming this week. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Hope you guys enjoy your weekend, and I will see you guys next week.
Learning more about
I have no idea. I would say, you know, generally, I'd say five is pretty safe. But I always ask them. I always ask for everybody. But I know there's at least 2 other items being offered at the time. I think they want to balance. So I don't know. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, and then we'll send you an email for the
Yeah. Send me an email and then I'll stick an adjective. Yep. See you guys.